reading Zhuangzi, requires a lot of imagination. Like you have to abandon the kind of so, you know, carefully socially constructed, right? This mindset. Just abandon that and empty yourself, your mind out of those social doctrines, moral doctrines, and then become transparent, right? By abandoning language, all of a sudden I lose my language. But Zhuangzi says, yes, that's the first step. The next step, right, is learn to hear, right, the sound around you. So
Hello, my name is Skylar Kempton. Welcome to my channel. In my videos, I'll cover politics, philosophy, and religion, sometimes all three topics at once. And this very first video on the channel does indeed land at the intersection of these three very big topics. Who better to set the standard than Zhuangzi? To talk about Zhuangzi, I'm thrilled to have on Dr. Peng Yu. Peng is an associate professor of politics at Earlham College in Richmond, Indiana. He's published scholarly articles on Taoism and Zhuangzi in particular, including Writing from Underground, Silence, Solitude, and the Fugitive Politics of Taoism in Mu Xin's Prison Notes, Zones of Indeterminacy, Art, Body, and Politics in Taoist Thought, and the article we will be discussing today, Indeterminate Self, Subjectivity, Body, and Politics in Zhuangzi. He also contributed the chapter Be Water, My Friend, Protest, Identity Politics, and Democracy in Hong Kong for the book Globalizing Political Theory. Full disclosure, I took numerous classes with Peng as a student at Earlham College and previously interviewed him about the state of Chinese politics for my blog, politicscolumn.org, back in 2018. Peng, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today about Zhuangzi.
thank you for having me.
So first of all, just set the stage for us. Who was Zhuangzi the person, and what was the social, political, and philosophical world that he lived in?
So Zhuangzi is a preaching Chinese philosopher who lived roughly around fourth, fifth century BCE. In pre-Qing China, we say pre-Qing China because the state of Qing, and there was a very chaotic situation where the states were fighting wars against each other, right? So there was an interstate war, military conquest, and eventually one of the state emerged as the most powerful, and it's the state of Qing, right? Spread as QIN, that it united China for the first time. Most of the philosophers I deal with come from this pre-Qing era, where they were debating, arguing against each other in order to influence politics. So Zhuangzi was one of the philosophers in the pre-Qing era. And he was, I think he is the author of the, not the entire book, because many of us believe that the books was put together later on, several hundred years later. But we believe that he's author of the first few chapters, the so-called inner chapter, right? And then he was basically someone who was very well learned, very well versed, had very different opinions about politics at the time. The preaching era, like I said, it was marked by interstate war, chaos, very unstable situation. And so one common theme that many of the philosophers were thinking was in response to this situation is, how do we restore peace and security, right? And Zhuangzi was the one who had a very different opinion about peace and security at that time. He served as a low-ranking government official at some point, and very quickly he determined that it's not his thing and it was wasting up his time. And he started writing on maybe strangely, right? You would think that a philosopher, like a serious political philosopher, would, like Confucius, right, would spend more time talking about morality, ethical life, and then how a political order can be derived from there. But Zhuangzi was basically talking about um, nature, right? Animals, right? The the people who look very different, right, would look usually considered as ugly, right? And people who are handicapped, who are usually marginalized in societies. And Zhuangzi thought that these are the ones who basically embody the true virtue of, right, the mandate of the heaven, right? They're the ones who are supposed to be the sage, not the so-called, dreams, right? This noble man, right? This term used in Confucian philosophy to describe the scholars, right? The role models of a society, right? So he's a very idiosyncratic, right? Very different kind of philosopher. And what's interesting is that, a lot of people still find him and he's writing very relevant even today. So, um,
Yeah, so you mentioned that there's sort of a distinction between Zhuangzi, the person, and Zhuangzi, the text. That Zhuangzi is thought to have written the opening chapters, or what's called the inner chapters of the text.
mhm.
But the text also involves a bunch of different authors and compilers. So how did the text Zhuangzi come to be in the contemporary form?
How to be the contemporary form. Like I mentioned briefly, it was put together by scholars later on, who apparently was very much influenced by the Taoist teaching, right? So his name was Guo Shang, right? So, and he was the one who, select the texts, right? Perhaps also tossed away others, and then figure out that, this is something that I can put together in a, right, common theme, under a common theme, and then give it a name that runs, right? But there's also argument that um, suggests that maybe it was multiple hands, not just the one, that actually contributed to the contemporary, like the modern form of the book, right? So we don't know, maybe. So, but one thing for sure is that the authorship is pretty vague. The Most people believe the inner chapter is authored by Zhuangzi himself, but the miscellany chapter, the outer chapter, those chapters are very much a result of, multiple authorship, right? So, and sometimes you can even tell that uh, they contradict each other, right? So it's more coherent for the inner chapter, but the outer chapter and then the miscellany chapter is probably a result of uh, scholars influenced by other schools of philosophy that also add to, right, their understanding of Zhuangzi, and somehow they were selected in the their writing selected in the book. So
Yeah, it's remarkable for me reading Zhuangzi how alive the text is, how relevant it feels to
yeah,
me in 2024. Given that it's so old, first of all, and it's gone through all of this process, all of this splicing, cutting, and eventually for me, translating into English. And my translation is by A.C. Graham that I've read. And I've just actually read the inner chapter, so I haven't read the whole
mhm.
book, but I've read what's considered to be authored by Zhuangzi. That's what I'll focus on
Mhm.
today. Um, so Zhuangzi is considered a Taoist, but it doesn't seem, from what I read, it doesn't seem like he thought of himself as a Taoist or even necessarily
For
that
sure.
that
Yeah.
term existed at that time. So talk about sort of the relationship between Zhuangzi and Taoism as a whole.
So the name I think was given much later, right? When people were studying these different schools of philosophy, and then they figured that, oh, maybe we can put, Dao De Jing and Zhuangzi, right, Huainanzi, right, these books together, and maybe a couple other texts, and then give it a name Taoism. So when Zhuangzi was writing, he definitely was not thinking that he was one of those, right? It's canonic Taoist philosopher, right? So his name was given by people who followed their studies much later on. So, Um, so um, Um, so Taoism as a school of philosophy emerged and then sort of flourished several hundred years later. And then, but what's interesting is that it's always been treated at the very marginal level because Confucianism, right, was pretty much dominating the Chinese intellectual history, and Taoism, as you can tell, right, was not very popular for various reasons, right? It was not emphasizing the kind of hierarchy that would support a feudal, right, governance, a feudal system, and it's very elusive, right? Sometimes hermetic kind of way of life. It is not good for a well-governed political society, right? In a well-governed political society, you want sort of structure, right? Most likely a hierarchical structure. You want people to have a very good idea about where they stand in the society, their position, right? Their obligations to the right to each other and so forth. And if you read Zhuangzi, right, um, anything that's very much like imposed, right, a moral order from the outside, it's going to be a problem here. So from the point of view of ruler, right, a book like Zhuangzi might not be very helpful, although the book is also full of interesting lessons for rulers to learn, right? But in general, I think it's not one of those books that would be, well received by the rulers. So they would like the rulers were very much more into like legalism, right? Why a legal system, like a legal framework, is more important than anything else, or the moral teaching, right? That seek to bind people together, right? Uh, uh, in accordance with uh, the moral principles, right? They make more sense to the rulers. So
Yeah, it's interesting. Taoism's role in China's intellectual history and the conversation among different schools of thought.
yeah,
Um, before we get into specifically talking about the political implications of Zhuangzi and what Zhuangzi thought about politics, I want to just kind of give a flavor of the text as a whole. And what I think I'll argue here, I think you would agree with, is that sort of the whole text has political implications. But I'll
Mm.
just start with sort of this passage has to do with uselessness. I love this passage. So this is Zhuangzi talking to somebody else. He says, "Now, if you have a great tree and think it's a pity it's so useless, why not plant it in the realm of nothing, whatever in the wild would spread out into nowhere and go
yeah.
roaming away to do nothing at its side, ramble around and fall asleep in its shade. Spared by the axe, no thing will harm it. If you're no use at all, who will come to bother you?" So, for Zhuangzi, why is it a good idea to be useless?
Well, I think it's thinking about this from what he saw at the time where, the scholars were pretty busy and the ruler as well, putting together a kind of social system where there's very strict, right, rules for that regulates people's life, right? You can do, certain things as permitted by, right, the moral or the legal codes, right, within this very limited, right, realm, right, of social custom or legal rule, et cetera, et cetera. And drawn to think that is not the way uh, to really, right, liberate people from those things. What we should do is to uh, truly find a way to like look at the world very differently from a very holistic point of view, right? So you cannot limit yourself to the very utilitarian way of thinking about yourself and your relation with the world, right? Like whatever is useful, whatever is going to be good for my profit or right, for my own like benefit or interest, then I'll do it. Zhuangzi think that's very much limiting people's mind, and it's going to cause a lot of problem, right? So he thinks that uh, the fullness of life should be the ultimate goal that regulates people's relation with their world, including this both the human and non-human world, right? As a whole, right? So if you're looking at the tree, and from the point of view of a carpenter, right, this old, right, very much like twisted, right, a tree is not going to be useful because it's very hard to make use of it, right? Uh, but if you think from a different point of view and say the tree grows, in a very natural way, grows in a way that pleases itself, regardless what kind of furniture it can turn itself into, so much so that it enjoys the life to its full extent is the most important thing here, right? So Zhuangzi would rather see or highlight this uselessness in people's life and people's relationship with the nature, right, as a whole, and rather than you know look at this world from a very, I don't know, like a predatory kind of, right, perspective and say, oh, the only way to define my relationship with the world is the extent to which I can make use of them for my own purpose, right? And that is going to be disastrous. Uh, if, for example, the ruler only look at the people and say, um, right, my relationship with my people, my subjects, is defined by the extent to which they could, sustain my regime, my rule, right? And at whatever cost it will take, then Zhuangzi would argue that it's going to be disastrous because you'll very easily go to war, right, with other countries because you don't value the life of the people, right? You don't respect their, choices. You don't respect their way of life. You don't respect their life at all. And that's going to be a problem here, right? So this idea of usefulness, right, is uh, is is destructive in so many ways, right? Be it morally useful or politically useful or legally useful, they all come from this idea that you know you can be, you know, uh, uh, you can be valuable only, you know, to the extent that you can be made use of, right? So that's something that worries Johns deeply, I think. So.
A topic in philosophy that has been significant recently, but certainly is not new, is philosophy of language. And Zhuangzi talks a fair amount about language philosophy. He criticizes a way of labeling things in a very static, absolute way of saying, this is what this is, and this is what this is not. Um, how would you describe, or how would you summarize or give a sense of Zhuangzi's language philosophy?
I think he would see language as problematic to the extent that, language clarifies, right? Language defines, and language, by doing that, language sets boundaries for everything, right? So he's talking about this in opposition to another school of philosophy called Mingjia, right? Name, right? So those are the ones who are, more interested in giving names to, different categories, right? And label things and then relations. And Zhuangzi is saying that in general, language is not to be trusted, right? He famously said that, where can I find someone who um, uh, toes away, right? Abandon language so I can be a friend of, right, with him or her, right? So this is something that um, really interests me because in so many ways, right? When you think about politics, I teach politics, right? You think about politics, there's no way that you cannot have a language that helps you clarify and then, right, express yourself clearly, right? And not only that, you should also be very well versed in the grammar, vocabulary, how the language is used or put together in expressing yourself, right? In other words, a clear and effective communication is the precondition, right? Prerequisite for someone to be counted as, qualified as political, right? Right. If you cannot speak well, if you could not express yourself well, if you cannot communicate with someone well, if you cannot reason, right, well, then you're considered as apolitical, right? So a lot of people who are, let's say, for example, not able to speak clearly, who prefer to be silent for whatever reason, are usually considered as apolitical, right? So they're very much repressed because you know um, uh, they just lack this kind of uh, knowledge, right? To or skill to make the best use of language in a way that's recognized by the society. And that's exactly the problem that Wallace Zhuangzi, right? He would suggest that um, giving clear names or label things, right, in such a way would very much limit, right, our relationship with these things, right? So if you see, a tree and then you give the name to the tree and then say that's what else can this be? It's just a tree, right? And then that very much limit your understanding of your relationship with the tree. It could not be just a tree. It could be more than a tree. It's another form of life. It's part of this ecosystem. It's the whole. It hosts so many other lives, right? That live on this tree, and then it's essential part of the uh, ecosystem. And once you think that way, right, so language become useless. In a sense, a language cannot precisely describe what this is, and then therefore your relationship with it, right? So for Zhuangzi, and I think he's also getting this a little bit from Lao Tzu, who is the philosopher, uh, you know, um, um, associated with Tao Te Ching, right? Another classic Taoist text. Maybe silence is preferred over, uh, and Zhuangzi always link or associate language with, he called this petit knowledge, right? It's this knowledge that you basically use to debate with others, right? And then what's the good, right? You just basically find yourself trapped in all those kind of logical traps, right? Like you're trying to debate with each other in order to win this argument. Uh, and then you lose sight of the bigger picture here, right? You would spend hours and hours and days debating with your peers, right? Trying to convince them if this is the right name for this thing. And then, and the result of that is uh, you lose sight of what's more meaningful here, right? So I think for Zhuangzi, language is not helpful to the extent that um, it um, sets all kinds of boundaries around us, right? And those boundaries are more harmful than helpful here. And if you want to liberate yourself from those social constraints set up by the language, right, by the names, the so-called, then the first thing you want to do is to uh, uh, alienate yourself from this very, familiar, dominant, linguistic system, right? That provides only one way of explaining the whole world, right? Johnson would say that maybe birds are chirping, that could also be language, right? Maybe, the sound of, and he used this example here, the wind, the sound of the wind is like the sound, like the piping of the heaven. And then that's maybe the also a kind of language that we don't understand, but it's a language, right? It's the mother nature speaking and talking to us in a way that it's illegible, maybe first in the first at the very beginning legible to us. We don't understand it, but you should learn this kind of language. So the language of heaven is more inclusive than the language of man, language of mankind. Yeah.
Zhuangzi really questions sort of human exceptionalism, right? I mean, he sort of is, we think about these things that are amazing about humans. We have language, we have reason, we have all those things. Zhuangzi is skeptical of these. He's skeptical of the idea that this sort of separates us from everything else in the
Yeah.
world, the other forms of life. This is something we should. You seem to think it's something we should be super entirely proud of, but there's some problems with it as well, that can
Yeah.
be isolating, disconnecting, perhaps.
Yeah, and I think that it's also because, language is you rather, use as a tool, right? For moral indoctrinations or like for whatever political reasons. And it's not really there to liberate people from, right, the social constraints they're faced with. And so I think it's also, you know, linked with his idea of uselessness, right? Maybe we need to invent a different kind of language that seems to be useless, at the first glance, but then it's deeply meaningful here. That's how you build this kind of really, you're bound with, for example, non-humans. Just listen to the sound that they make. They're speaking to us, right? Even though it's not the human language, it's not logical, right? Maybe, but it's the sound itself that is talking. So I think that reading Zhuang's, requires a lot of imagination. Like you have to abandon the kind of you know, carefully socially constructed, right? This mindset. Just abandon that and empty your mind out of those social doctrines, moral doctrines, and then become transparent, right? By abandoning language, all of a sudden I lose my language. But Zhuangzi says, yes, that's the first step. The next step, right, is learn to hear, right, the sound around you. So
Yeah, yeah. So I want to turn to your essay, Indeterminate Self, Subjectivity, Body and Politics in Zhuangzi. Just at the very beginning, in fact, in the abstract of the essay, you write, quote, I submit that the authors of Zhuangzi propose a depoliticizing approach to politics, whereby effortless action replaces established processes in reinventing new relations and subjects, end quote. So let's start with that idea of subjects. We'll talk about a concept that's not in Zhuangzi, but you talk about, in the essay, which is political subjectivity or political subjectivation, right? So what is political subjectivity? How does it relate to how can um, how can we put Zhuangzi in conversation with political subjectivity?
yeah, so first of all, I think there's still a debate in the scholarship about to what extent we could, you know, employ those modern terms to approach an ancient text like, Zhuangzi, because it's people would say that you're reading really out of the historical context of this, and we should be strictly reading this within the context. But on the other hand, there are also people, and I'm sort of like aligning myself with them, is that we should maybe do more than just like restrict our readings within this very specific context, right? The historical context, to have these ancient philosophers in conversation with the issues we have right now, right? Because I think political subject when I was writing, I was thinking about, the international migrants, right? The refugee problems here, and those whoever is sort of indeterminate. I use this term indeterminate in finding themselves a position in society. And I think Johns might be helpful here is because uh, I don't know if he was really thinking about this because it's a very modern thing that we're into political subjects, subjectivity, etc., right? Um, and it's which is usually associated with psychoanalysis or post-colonial theory, like Franz Fanon talk about this, right? But I think what we could learn from Trump is that if we take one step back and think about how do we depoliticize, right? I use this term here because what Jones argues against is this kind of typical, right, conventional political way of thinking about politics, right? There's hierarchical structure, there's a ruler sitting on the top, there is this kind of political institutions, right? Or at least the state, right? And you know, the only way to count someone as political is to see if this person is right participating in any way in those kind of political system, established system, right? And we're still doing this through in modern day politics, right? Democracy, voting is important, political representation is important, right? You know, mass media, right? Those are important because that's your way of participating in politics. But what Zhuangzi is saying here by depoliticizing is that maybe politics is more than just right, right, this materialization of those institutional life, right? Maybe it's beyond the state, right? If you think of this more broadly, right? So, um, one way to think about that is to think about how, for example, non-humans are also political, right? You are so inspired by the bees that flying around you, by looking at the tree that is regarded as useless, right? And then start thinking, what I could do in my relationship with other people in this human society, right? And and from there, and then you start to think about, ideas like identity, political subjectivity, right? And the process in which you form this political subjectivity is you cannot be solely based upon, right, this very material condition, right, of your social life that is very much part of the institution. I mean, if you think about media as another form of the institution as well, right? So, how do you rethink about politics beyond those conditions? How do you think about your identity that transcend those institutions, right? And people will usually panic, right? If I am not affiliated with a political party, if I'm not voting, if I'm not engaging in any of those mass media, then I'm lost, right? And I'm not political anymore, right? So, but Zhuangzi is saying that it's actually something to, worth celebrating because, you're thinking about politics in a more like a broader way that would be encompassing uh, the nature, right, the non-human world, and you're seeing that those are integral part of your political subjectivity, right? So how do we, for example, redefine citizenship, right? So citizenship is only defined insofar as, you know, uh, you're recognized legally, right? I'm an immigrant, and many immigrants, we understand how long, confusing, and humiliating this process of establishing yourself legally. You can wait years, right, in order to be recognized to get the paper in your hand. But Zhuangzi would say, and then of course, once again, he was not really thinking about citizenship because it's such a modern thing, right? But the implication here is that if he were to give it a suggestion about advice for citizenship, he probably would think that it's definitely beyond just legal, right? Legal, political, social, moral realm, and thinking about citizenship as some kind of membership, right? Um, Formed by non-institutional relations with, like more broadly speaking, with the nature, let's say indigenous people, their understanding of membership of the community is based on their relationship with the land, right? And that is something that we usually ignore. We will tend to neglect in our understanding of citizenship because, right? Um, right. So Zhuangzi would say that, you are a member of this community because essentially we're talking about membership, right? And a sense of belonging here as part of, the experience of your political subjectivity or identity is that maybe, I'm more defined by this very immediate relationship with my pets, right? With the land on which I live, with the tribes in which I find myself, with those, you know, uh, the rituals where I, worship my ancestors, right? In the way I protect my water, my land, et cetera, et cetera. Those are all sacred, right? So and those are useless in so many ways, or usually regarded as useless. But they're, indispensable for me to understand myself, right? So I was trying to think about along those lines when I'm reading Zhuangzi. So, but of course, it's not fair that to throw all these questions upon Zhuangzi because um, he was living in an ancient feudal society where a social political system is completely different from the modern.
Well, this is the fascinating issue of what you can put in a conversation with Zhuangzi, how you read Zhuangzi, what context you're thinking about, and you address this in the article. You write that your article, quote, makes no attempt to contributing to our debate over the existing notions, e.g., freedom, democracy, citizenship, in a way manifested in the works of many comparative political theorists. Instead, it is intended to introduce new terms to a rethinking of politics that are embedded and operative in their distinctly cultural political context, end quote. So what do we gain by introducing these terms that are new to Western political discourse? They're not new terms in the sense that Zhuangzi is very old, but what do we get by introducing these new terms to Western political discourse rather than considering what Zhuangzi can contribute to existing Western political terminology?
Oh, you're asking the specific terms from Zhuangzi that would be helpful here.
Well, so I guess I'm saying, what do we get by? So I mean, you talk about you bring in concepts from Zhuangzi. We talk about this. We just talked about the concept of political subjectivity, which is outside of Zhuangzi, but most of your paper discusses terms in the text, such as Sangwo, Xiao Yao, and a variety of terms that are key to Zhuangzi. So what do we get by introducing these terms rather than just kind of reading Zhuangzi through, like what does Zhuangzi believe about freedom, which is sort of, we kind of think of in a Western context. What does Zhuangzi think about democracy, that kind of thing?
Yeah, because I think one interesting part of reading Zhuangzi is that how do you build a kind of to um, have a conversation with like I said, the issues that we're dealing with now, right, in a radically different historical context. And that's why I say that Zhuangzi may still be relevant today because a lot of people find useful, right? When I use this term useful, but it's falling the trap of, right? But also like valuable things that you could learn from Zhuangzi, right? So I find those terms interesting, right? We don't have this term freedom, which is totally alien and strange for these Chinese philosophers. Um, but we still can get a taste of maybe freedom in Zhuangzi's um, articulating this idea of 逍遥, right? Which is a term that basically translates as you wander freely without borders, without boundary, right? And a lot of people describe this as a more of a spiritual kind of state in which you transcend, you go beyond all those limits in your mind in thinking about this world, and then like fully embrace, right, a kind of a spirituality where you can uh become part of the whole world in so many different ways, like totally unconstrained. That's Xiaoyao. But I'm also arguing that maybe it's something that's beyond the spiritual realm, right? Then that makes it more political because it's also about how do you see two completely different and strange bodies, right? They show up, that appear in front of you, and what do you make of them, right? If Xiaoyao is more than just a spiritual, wonder free, right? How did you deal with these bodies here in a way that is, truly free according to Zhuangzi, right? I'm then also interested in notions such as xu, right? XU, which is a term I use, um, I think, right, to describe different kind of political relationship. So that term is usually translated as emptiness or, blankness, or I would rather translate it as tenuousness, right? It's completely fluid, it's flowing, it's, indeterminate, unfixed on certain things, right, or ideas. Um, um, and I find this term useful to understand uh, the the very strange limbo state where many people find themselves in, like the immigrants, right? They belong to neither societies, and somehow they're still here living in the society, and then trying to invent a space of their own. Maybe the space is not recognized legally by the state, but it's important, right? And it's essential for their survival and the survival of their communities. So Xu is this very tenuous, always morphing, always changing, right? In terms of its both in terms of locality, in terms of temporality, they're always on the go, right? It's very nomadic, but it's like also politically meaningful here. So, so back to a question, I think reason I find these terms useful, other than just borrow the term from the Western philosophy, say freedom, or right, and then impose a kind of Western reading of Zhuangzi, would be, I don't think it's doing justice to the text, right? First of all, it's not really something that Zhuangzi is um, thinking about, right? I don't think he was really thinking about freedom in the Western sense of the term, like it's like, especially the negative sense of the term, like freedom from, like I'm just protected within my own bubble, and the state don't intervene, and then others are all my enemies. Zhuangzi, I think it's his idea of freedom is more constructive in the sense that we need a more meaningful relationship with each other. We don't always see people, we don't see people as our enemies or like burdens, etc., right? Who are there to take away our rights. Like I don't even think that he's thinking about this in the rights-based discourse. Like what is rights, right? So I find those helpful, right? Because we're still dealing with a lot of issues here in our modern society, and then we don't have a way out, right? We continue to return back to those terms that we're most familiar with. We're just adding more to those terms, like what is rights, how do we define it, what is freedom of speech, right? What is our constitutional rights, right? What is our freedom or sovereignty, right? What is sovereignty? But they gave us even more problems. So what I like about these Chinese philosophers, though they differ from each other like substantially, right? But they come up with these terms, and it's not just limited to the Chinese philosophers, right? That we can use to provide a critique, right, of the terms that we're most familiar with in the West, and think more broadly about politics beyond those terms. So I don't know if that answers your question, but
Yeah, no, absolutely. So let's talk more about two terms I think are key, that you wrote about in your essay, Sangwo and Xiaoyao. You write, quote, Sangwo, or losing the self, pertains to the state in which one detaches from perpetuated self and instead embraces nomadic self. This dynamic results in what is called Xiaoyao in Zhuangzi, a stage in which political relations are radically rearranged in opposition to predetermined structure, end quote. So it seems like there's this relationship between the two terms where losing the self leads to this new rearranged political relations and probably social relations. So could you just say some more about those concepts, Sanwo and Xiaoya?
so Sunwar, I think, is from one of the stories there, and we were thinking about how do you um um right lose yourself, right? So there's a couple options here, like you just basically forget everything. Would that qualify for like losing yourself? And obviously it's no, right? Or if I just follow what I was told, not you know, adding anything of my own interest or my own idea, my own thoughts. Would that qualify for Sangwo? No, it's not. So a true Sangwo would be, you sit and forget. He used this 10-2-1, right? Sit and forget, where your mind is completely in those kind of a 逍遥, right, state where um you basically empty out, right? There's nothing. And I always use this kind of comparison here. Is just like looking at the mirror, right? The mirror is supposed to uh right, being between you and the mirror is supposed to be no other objects like a lens or whatever. It should be like a transparent, right? A truthful, transparent reflection of you. But once you have other lenses like moral, right? If you're doing this, think about yourself through, look at yourself through the lens of morality, for example, then the you reflecting the mirror is going to be distorted you, right? Apparently, it's not a genuine you. That's the you that is very much well packaged and well accepted by the society, right? So Sangwa is to get rid of those lenses, the apertures through which you look at yourself, right? Money, power, social status, reputation, fame, profit, all those kind of things. And then just look at the mirror and ask yourself, who am I without all these things, right? And so it's like a spiritual kind of mental, right? A state of emptiness. But I think it's also a very active process of emptying yourself out. It's like hollow out yourself, right? So there's really nothing there in your mind. Um, a close, example probably would be meditation, right? You just basically sit there and then try not to be, right? Um, and then so that's pretty much Sangwo. And what's the next did you say Xiaoyao or
Yeah.
yeah, so I mentioned Xiaoyao is the state where you eventually want to find yourself in, right? uh that you're not bothered by anything, right? From external world, right? uh the stress of the work would not bother you, right? The a good career, let's say, would not bother you, right? This kind of any of the social um, doctrines will not bother you, and then you eventually are, being truly free. Like you can wander everywhere in this world without any boundaries, right? Spiritually, mentally, or physically. This is just something that I think probably is the highest level of emancipation or something. So
Yeah, it seems that there's this process that's discussed in this story, um, where Zhuangzi actually uses the character of Confucius, talking
yeah, yeah,
to
yeah,
Shi Hui, is that right? Where Yen Hui,
yeah. That's
yeah,
his
Yen
favorite
Hui
disciple.
called
Yeah.
on Confucius and asked leave to travel to advise the Lord of Wei, and Yen Hui has this idea of how he's going to
Yeah,
advise the
yeah.
king and make everything better and make this sort of despotic king a better guy, and Confucius, the character,
Mhm.
who is really sort of saying what Zhuangzi wants to say, it seems. Says you're not going to be able to advise this king if you're just going to go in there with your morals, your kind of rule book of how you
Mhm.
think he should behave, and Confucius, again, the character, ends up sort of saying you have to undergo this process of, it seems like, of losing the self. I think he talks about fasting of the heart. Um, and then you have to lose this sort of your,
Yeah, like I don't know, like with any kind of preconceived ideas and
yeah,
thoughts that you would bring to this relationship, it's gonna kill you. right?
Yeah, right. Yeah, that the king actually will kill you because you're going to you're going to show off the
Yeah,
king. You're going
yeah,
to tell him he's not doing the right thing. You're going to appear to be more. I think he talks about I think you mentioned in the essay as well that you're sort of uh, flaunting your beauty at the ugliness of the king, so to speak, your moral beauty.
yeah,
Um, and so Confucius, the character, says that you have to kind of get into the state where you're able to react in a much more intuitive way, and
hmm,
then you finally will be able to actually behave the right way, to take the right actions, the right political actions, in your
yeah,
behavior with the king. Um, so yeah, so maybe let's build it out a little bit more, sort of. And obviously, this is sort of one passage. I don't want to kind of, Zhuangzi resists any kind of rule book of
yeah,
how you should behave, or what you have to do to be a better person or a better political actor. But it's this fascinating um, process of losing the self, um, going to this much more intuitive state. Practicing something that seems like meditation, like this kind of controlled breathing. There's this element of what seems to me to be a spiritual practice involved in this. And
mhm.
then finally, you can be an actor which can behave in the right way, following the way. I think Chuang-Tzŭ might put it,
Mhm.
and kind of do the right things in the right moment at the right time. Um,
Yeah,
so I think more you want to say about that to kind of
yeah, I
spell that
think
out
so. I
more.
think that's one of the most read and then, I mean, talked about or discussed story in the Zhuangzi. And I think very well speak to the idea of losing yourself, right? Is, the three scenarios, right? Are going to be non-starter, right? The way you prepare yourself because, um, you're still trying to do something that's proactive, right? To convince the ruler that, you should give up killing people, you should give up your brutality, and then give up being a tyrant whatsoever, right? And what's funny about this is that Confucius is completely a fictional character, right? And Zhuangzi is create like invented this character just to make fun of Confucius, to contradict himself. Like now you're the Taoist sage, and then you're speaking against yourself. But then how fun is that? So I think Zhuangzi is very playful, like very playful, sarcastic kind of, a very joyful person to talk to. So yeah, so and Yan Hui is Confucius' favorite student, right? The disciple who is basically morally upright and then study very hard, very diligent, work very hard on his study, etc. But he's still gonna face, right, the problems here is all he's prepared uh, um, solutions, right, approaches, the methods will be non-starter because you're going to deal with a tyrant who is brutal, cruel, and not going to be convinced or persuaded in any way. And then once you show this person that you are like morally or intellectually superior to this person, right, you're going to be killed, right? And the best way to do that is just to be like him. Like if he's a baby crying, you like also cry like a baby, right? You just behave in a way that it's so natural to this ruler, and then that way you just basically change this person. Maybe, right? Maybe you will change this person, maybe you will not, but at least you won't die. And that's the best result is you won't die for this, I don't know, like a stupid mission in front of you, right? Um, yeah, so I think that's a really interesting um, that's really interesting paragraph where being transparent is super important in your relationship with others, right? And a lot of times we have these problems with others because we have deeply rooted misconceptions about their life, right? Their values, and we try to correct them, right? And then that give us a lot of problem. And then Zhuangzi says that maybe a transparent self, an indeterminate self, an open self, and just don't, judge at the very beginning, but try to figure out what this person is, right? Um, and there's like a lot, like full of like possibilities in when it comes to how you engage this person. But the most important thing is just disregard this well-established self that I am a intellectual, I'm morally superior, that I'm smarter than you, and I'm here to offer you some prescriptions to lead the way out of, right, lead you out of this. No, right? Johnson says that this won't, you know, take you anywhere. So
I really like this concept of the completed heart, which for Zhuangzi is a bad thing.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah, the idea that if you have,
mm,
you're sort of, you are this thing, you are this moral person. You show up in a situation with a completed heart. You have your rule book. You know what you want to do. You know how you want it to go.
yeah,
That never works out, And how often do we show up? Do all of us show up to a situation thinking I have it all figured out, I'm prepared. I have all these notes for this interview. I have a completed heart going to this interview, and it doesn't. It never works out just the way you
yeah,
think.
yeah,
Other people will thwart your completed heart. They're coming in there with their completed heart. Perhaps there's going to inevitably be this conflict.
yeah,
I'm more familiar with Buddhism than Taoism. It reminds me a bit of a Buddhist teaching that I heard talking about, if
yeah,
you are something, it's a turmoil. Even if you are,
yeah,
consider yourself, you are a enlightened person, you're I think it's called a once returner or a stream enterer, different forms of enlightened beings. If you
yeah,
are this thing, it's a turmoil. You have
yeah,
to, you have to forget, in Zhuangzi's language, forget about being this thing, even if you're a monk, you forget about being a monk. If you're showing up there as a monk, as an enlightened person, this is my identity, that will lead you to turmoil, and probably the same thing, you are a, you are a moral, upstanding person. That's great, but you also paradoxically sort of have to forget that.
yeah,
Uh, and so it's a fascinating and a fascinating point, and something that just really, to me, speaks, is incredibly practical. It speaks, to my life. It's something that I've thought about in living my life, and so that's I think what I go to philosophy for. Actually, is the very practical things, but for myself, for engaging with the world. So that's I think a very um,
right.
special part of Zhuangzi. Um, you've written a lot about the body in Zhuangzi, so let's talk about that. How does the body feature into Zhuangzi's philosophy and politics?
I mean, this is a very interesting topic here because there's debate in the literature, right? Some people think that body is not concerned by the drums, the when you talk about fast your mind, sit and forget, right? Ultimately, the body will wither. The body will wither, and then you become, wandering free, and then right, you're not bothered by the body, you don't right. But I feel like, body is not something to be a kind of burden or something needs to be overcome, right? In order to achieve that kind of state, right? Of let's say Xiaoyao or true freedom. What I think is what I'm trying to figure out in the Zhuangzi is that if the Zhuangzi really has a theory for the body, and my answer is I do think so because even though at times the body seems to be less significant, like or like meaningful. It can be just withered away. But I think ultimately drones want us to think that, you know, it's just like a completed heart, right? Once you think that the body is completed, then once you have this completed body, then all other possibilities are eliminated. I was fascinated by the story where three friends were talking to each other about death, and then they somehow you know, one said that, oh, when I die, my my finger is going to be part of the limb of a horse, and another one said, "Oh yeah, my hair is going to be one of the feather of a bird or something like that." And then they started to laugh, and then when they're talking about death, it's so casually, right? And then in a way that they think that death is definitely not the end of your life circle, but the beginning of another one, right? If you think about that way. And I feel like it's not just about the ending of a life or this life, right? Or the beginning of a next life, but there's a continuation, right? Of the body in a different forms, right? It can be met. This I don't know if it's metamorphosis or something like somehow your hands become the limb of a horse, but it's like the body is not yours to own, right? It's probably part of the nature. You don't possess it. It's not your property, right? Once you die, your body becomes something else, right? And the life of the body continues, right? And then there's also Zhuangzi's praise of those so-called ugly people, right? There's this person whose eyes are on the top of his head, and then the shoulder grows so high, right? It's even higher than his head. In so many ways, right? They they're not accepted by the norm of the aesthetics in any given society, right? And then their body seems to be like really useless aesthetically, right? Socially, morally. And in ancient China, um, I think people have very strict moral standards for like a beautiful body, what is considered as a beautiful body, because it's part of your moral character, right? That you cultivate your body in certain ways, you behave in certain ways, and your body moves in certain ways, all carry this kind of social meaning here. But Zhuangzi's attack of this kind of moralization of the body, or the so-called beautiful body, is that body could be in whatever shape it can be, right? It can be like this, can be like that. It doesn't matter. The most important thing is that it's it's a very important in and of itself, um, um, a part of the process of achieving the fullness of your life, right? Um, and for that, you should, I mean, you should one realize that the incomplete body is actually great, right? The body that is probably, you maybe it's not able body, right? But that's great. That probably gives you another understanding of your body and then your relationship with the world, right? You all of a sudden realize that the spaces of the society is very limited, right? And then become aware of some serious issues about, how to treat the bodies equally in a society. Whereas, if you, right, if you give priority to always able body or beautiful body, then you tend to, marginalize the bodies that um, they're not qualified for this, right? This category, and then there's a whole lot of problem that can be created out of that, right? So I think this is still my argument that I think the Zhuangzi has a particular you know, argument for the body. And I think it's important. Sometimes it's overlooked by the literature, and people would just focus on the spiritual kind of or the mentality, right, to understand Zhuangzi. But I think all these bodies, right, presented in the book, it's so interesting that there's no way that you could ignore these interesting bodies, right, that are non-conformative.
Something that I struggle with a little bit reading Zhuangzi is this idea of blandness. You seem to talk about that it's good to sort of have a bland experience where you're not, perhaps that you're not attached to a particular sense experience, or you're not sort of focused on one way of experiencing the world. He talks about, and you talk about in your essay, this idea of uh, living without particular organs. where in other words the body is sort of not divided. So perhaps that's to do with that. But I'm still a little bit confused about it. Given sort of the multitude of experiences that you have as a human being, as a living being, with multiple different flavors and sensation stuff, why does Zhuangzi favor experiencing blandness, having this bland experience?
I think I actually borrowed this term from Deleuze and Guattari, the body without organs. But I think that I'm trying to stage a conversation here because I find it's very interesting, right? So the idea of blandness is really has a lot to do with this term "she," right? The tenuousness, the emptiness of right? And I think the body is important here because uh, the body provides this kind of vagueness that does not distinguish one particular sensation from the rest of from others, right? So there's a story where you know um, um, somebody was asked why all your organs are together. Like you cannot tell where's your ear, your nose, and then every day you do something to cut, right? Cut out, right? I mean, to try to make an organ out of your body. Like today, you're gonna give you a nose, and tomorrow eyes, and next day the pair of ears, and there's mouth, and then you have all these right organs in your body that would enable you to uh, sort of appreciate different have different senses of the world. And then the last day, that person died because I think that story is really interesting. Once you have all these undistinguishable organs, maybe you don't even have an organ on your body, then you basically shut off, right? That's all these sensations, and then you try what you only sense is this, right? This the taste of blandness, right? And you don't have this intense taste of anything that could eventually uh, give you a very distorted, right, a reality here. So I think it's still part of this kind of self-cultivation process where you try to empty out your mind, and blandness here is the key, right? Um, you eat bland stuff, you eat them slowly, right? You try not to distinguish, and then try to ask yourself, is what I see really what I see here? Is what I hear, is what I, really hear? Um, um, and maybe they're here to distort my mind about this world. Like we're all told to do certain things as we grow up. Our parents want us to do X, Y, and Z. At school, we're told to do, X, Y, and Z. And then after graduation, the society wants to do, certain things, right? And they keep intensify our vision, our sensations of our body to sort of inscribe those kind of norms on your body so much so that it's just like an immediate, like knee-jerk kind of reaction to it. You don't even have to think about it. And that worries Zhuangzi, right? Zhuangzi would say that we need more blandness, right? We need more emptiness in our sense so that we're not fooled by our eyes, we're not fooled by our ears, and we're not fooled by what we smell and taste in our mouth, right? Um, Always go inward, back to your heart, right? Listen to your heart, listen, to the chi, right? The flowing energy, and then that you start to establish the connection, right? A meaningful connection with the nature. Because we don't have those, intensified taste of, I don't know, like sweetness in the nature. That's just not unreal, right? But you keep feeding those kind of things because, you think it will make you happy, right? Once you have those intensified senses, um, you're taken away from um, the real world. I think that's what I'm trying to get at here. Um,
Yeah, that's really interesting, and that is clarifying because I don't think I quite got it before. But that does make sense. Um, a topic
So
that
it's
I'm
also
sort
like
of
something, I'm sorry. So it's also like something like the slow food culture, right? Is as a way to resist this capitalist, this fast food or like a quick production, mass production of certain kind of tastes. because they keep intensify and then makes you feel like, give you this kind of sensual pleasure. But Zhuangzi would say that it's a just distorted version of, right, what the food should be taste about. So
Yeah, yeah. This idea that I've been really interested in for a while, is this idea of non-dualism, non-dualist philosophy. And it seems to be, it's not my own idea, but there seems to be a thread through different philosophical and religious traditions, or versions of philosophical religious traditions, of non-dualism. And non-dualism in the sense that there is this connection between um, the individual and the world that is quite deep and profound. That is, real in some sense. That yes, in some sense we're individuals, but in another sense we are connected. We are maybe part of a whole. Well, that's a little bit, the language there is a little bit, can be contentious. I've heard this idea. I don't think this is from Taoism, but that it, that I forget what the original term was, but that we are uh, not two. Maybe we're not one, but we're not two. In other words, me and you, me and the rest of the world are not two different things. And maybe it is one. But this idea of non-dualism in philosophy, yeah, this thread seems to be in some different religious and philosophical traditions, that there isn't really, on a fundamental level, there isn't the separation between me and you, between me and the rest of the world, between me and God. Perhaps we want to talk about God. There's sort of a connection there. There's not just sort of a separate God that is, sort of the father or the master, but there's sort of a connection. And so, do you think that Zhuangzi could fairly be considered a non-dual philosopher in sort of this broad sense?
I think so in certain ways, although I'm not going to be conclusive here because these texts is so open and also, like I said, it's sometimes it's self-contradictory because it's multiple authorship that add to this text. So, but if I definitely think there is this kind of non-dualistic, aspect of it, like segment of Zhuangzi that would, uh, go beyond. He's the one who basically is anti, morality, right? So he would find this kind of good versus bad, evil versus good, right? As problematic, right? At the social moral level. And he will always see things uh, connected one way or another, rather than being, sitting on the two extreme ends of the spectrum and then opposing each other, right? Um, he does not see, contradictions within, the things in the world, because there are always way you could, communicate with them, right? And it's non-dualistic in a way that animals are not the opposite of humans, right? And we could still communicate, right? There's like a very interesting story where Zhuangzi was talking to uh, somebody, his favorite interlocutor, right, who is also a logician, right? Walking by on the bank of a river, and then suddenly Zhuangzi says that, oh, the fish are happy, and then his friend said, oh, you're not fish. How do you know fish are happy? He said, I just know fish is happy. But he is like, no, I mean you. Then Zhuangzi said, let's take step back, and then going back to the original question, you ask me, how do I know the fish is happy? I know this by looking at the fish that they're happy, right? So I don't know what do we make of this story here. Apparently, Zhuangzi is the fish, and then the way they swim, and then playing with each other resonate with Zhuangzi. Zhuangzi apparently is not a fish; it's a human, and the fish is not speaking a human language, and then somehow uh, it's there's connection here that cannot be described by language, right? If you want to ascribe a very precisely defined, term of happiness to the fish, then maybe they're not happy, right? But they're happy in their own ways, and I perceive that happiness. I receive that happiness in my mind, and I think that's important. And I declare that the fish is happy, right? So this is definitely non-dualistic in my opinion, right? And and I think that's important to understand Zhuangzi. So and I'm sure we can find many more examples. But yeah, that's at least just my initial thought about like what immediately jumped in mind. So
Let's talk more about this idea of a depoliticizing approach to politics. We were talking before we started recording about my challenges thinking about how to be involved in politics, how to conceptualize politics. I mean, there's sort of um, this level that we're talking about here of political theory and thinking about an ideal way of thinking about politics. There's sort of politics as it exists in the world in sort of an official sense. Um, you were talking about how you can still be political and not be engaged with the state, not voting, for instance. For me, I think voting is very important. Engaging in the state is very important. I think, especially right now, it's very consequential.
I know,
So
yeah.
I'm not ready to disengage
No, no, I mean,
with
he's
with
not
with with
saying
the
that,
with the
yeah,
official
we're
state.
not saying, yeah, we're not saying that let's, it's like still like a either or kind of logic that
Right,
we ditch
precisely.
this and then try to replace with something else. I think it's important at all fronts. But I think for
Yeah.
drones, you just need to think of like more creatively about politics, of which voting is just one form of, right? So participating.
Right, right. And he talks about if you're going to advise the king, there's a lot of these pitfalls. He doesn't necessarily say don't advise the king, period, but he says there's all of these pitfalls. If you go into it the wrong way, you could die. That's not going to be
Exactly.
helpful.
Exactly. Yeah.
Um, and um, and so we have politics as it exists right now. It's conflictual. It's non-ideal. There's a lot of problems, a lot of complications. It seems to me that it's worthwhile to engage in it as it is. At the same time, um, it seems worthwhile to consider a very different approach to politics and to kind of engage in this different approach, try to build this different approach outside of official politics and inside of official politics perhaps. But this idea of a depoliticizing approach to politics is very appealing to me because it seems like the inherently conflictual, inherently sort of hierarchical system of politics is very flawed, and perhaps there's sort of this inherent problem with politics as we usually see it right now. So what is this idea of a depoliticizing approach to politics, and how can Zhuangzi inform us in trying to build a new politics?
I think, like we said, depoliticizing is not necessarily just saying that it's just either or, right? You give up on like voting, political representation or any kind of institutional life, because I think that's still important. And Zhuangzi's at time is radically different from now, right? And that it's inevitable, at least for Yan Hui to serve, right, the tyrant, the king of the of Wei. So, but I think, right, what is important here is that you need to find some unconventional ways of thinking about politics, right? Voting is still important. Definitely, we want to encourage the turnout for voting. That's a super important part of political life or being political. But depoliticizing also serve as a reminder, right, or encouragement to think that what can we do about politics outside those institutions, especially when the institution is now itself under attack, right. So like there are people, are question legitimacy of institution. That's one that is not, it's not not saying that institution is not important at all, but it's very, very important. Um, but um, this challenge to institutions, right? The rise of populism, right? Anti-elitism, anti, institutions is a signal that the institution cannot solve all the political problems here, right? So, and we need to think more creatively, more openly about politics to engage people maybe outside these institutions. So why it's depoliticizing? Because it's not following the traditional, right, the political procedures, or not, or at least are not thinking within the confine of the political processes, right, institutional life, um, but to find areas and spaces in our everyday life to be, political, right? It could be a critique of the political, right, establish the political processes and procedures, but I think it's also a call for more creative way of living politically, right? Would my relationship with my pets, tell me anything about politics, right? Would um, the way I prepare my food tell anything about, my identity with my community, my culture, right? Which are may or may not be recognized by the state, right? Is there any other immediate relationship that are meaningful to me, but also, seems to be remote and distant from the political institutions, right? So depoliticizing means really, I think, repoliticizing, right? It's about like how do you uh, uh, count the uncounted, right? Those that are previously regarded as apolitical could silence. I mean, you're studying at Earlham and we're at Quaker College, so silence is part of our ritual, and it's supposed to, bring the moment of silence is supposed to bring the community together, right? It's definitely not meaningless, right? It's very meaningful. Um, is this also depoliticizing, right? So
Some people who are by necessity outside of official politics are migrants, and you talk about the political subjectivity of migrants in your essay. So what can Zhuangzi tell us about this political subjectivity of migrants, and this complex, ever-changing political subjectivity that migrants have as they traverse national boundaries?
um once again, I don't think this is something that, this is definitely something that Johnson was not thinking about, right? At the time, I don't even know if there's a theory for like citizenship or migrants. Certainly, there's no such thing as sovereignty, right? Et cetera, et cetera. Or maybe there's border boundary, but maybe that's also like loosely defined compared with what the boundary and border means to modern day politics, right? To the extent you would require like a physical wall, right, to be set up in order to prevent these migrants from coming to this country. Um, but I think what Zhuangzi could be helpful here is that to think about these people, right, as incredibly capable and full of political agencies, right, in contributing to politics, to our communities in ways that are probably less recognizable to us, right? Um, so, and it's important to understand that in terms of the fluidity, right, of their, of the conditions of their conditions, and to see in what ways we can still, count these people, right, consider them as part of this community. And I think in so many ways they're already part of the right the society and the communities and making contribution um, to my economy or politics and this and that. But we just don't recognize that, right? And what Zhuangzi is doing here, I think, is to maybe try to convince people that fluidity is needed for us to understand them, right? Um, for sure we want to recognize them legally, give them like the papers they needed in order to establish themselves, right? That procedure, we're not saying that we should, abandon that completely, but also find other spaces where, these people could like thrive and flourish, right? Maybe that requires us to go beyond the very fixated, right? This, understanding of politics, right? And only taking place in institutions, but maybe we can do more for community service, um, um, to make them like more, at least publicly visible, right? In a society, and engage them outside, right? The political institutions, in whatever way we could. I don't think Zhuangzi has an answer for that, but we're just drawing some implications here to hopefully, um, right, uh, help us find a way to think about this issue like more, uh, I don't know, like differently. But this is just like something, I don't have like a conclusive answer to that, but it's something that I think I find interesting and potentially have good connection with Zhuangzi. So
Sure. So you talk about the body in Zhuangzi. The flip side of that is that Zhuangzi's politics and philosophy really can be embodied. I said that it strikes me as a very practical text, and by the nature of what he's saying, you can live his philosophy and politics. So I want to ask you, for my sake, for the sake of the viewers, what's just an example, like on the top of your head, of how we might go about our day today, or part of our day, in a Zhuangzian way.
I think you probably would really need a mind like a child to empty out your mind. And first of all, every little thing in your everyday life matter to you. And I think not just the Taoism or Zhuangzi, but also other like of Confucianism with the Chinese philosophy share in common is that, philosophy is practiced. It's not something that's written, or prepared as a lecture delivered to these people. It's always like analysis, the words, right, compiled by the disciples of Confucius, the master, right? And the master himself would object to this idea of and have anything written down. He would rather live his life as a role model and have people follow him rather than, engage in a kind of debate or argument with others, right? So it's a very much lived experience, right? A lived philosophy, that's important. And then from there, you derive this new political relationship. What kind of political? We don't know. I mean, that's exactly open for everyone to find out, right? How do you depoliticize, and how do you like repoliticize? How do you take care of your pets? How are you, taking care of people around you, right? Without any kind of purpose. It's a natural reaction to show your affection to others, to take care of them rather than, thinking about like, oh, I'm doing this because the society want me to do that. That make me look good as a moral, like a moral model or something like that. It's just so natural. Like Zhuangzi would say, taking care of your parents, it's so natural that does not require any kind of moral, indoctrination to teach you how to do that. Like Confucius would say, you need to take care of the elderly, and then in return, the elderly will show your respect to you. This is the very fundamental of human politics, human society. But Zhuangzi is saying, no, once you start telling people to do that, it's going to be distorted, the relationship. It's so natural that I want to take care of my parents. I don't need, anybody there to teach me how to do that. It's just me being a child and my parents being parents taking care of me, right? So something that's more spontaneous. Don't think too much about things that you do. Follow the Xin, right? The heart mind, right? Follow your Xin. Do things like more spontaneously, rather than like always bring a preconceived idea of what this is and then trying to express through your art. That's why I think Zhuangzi and Taoism attract a lot of artists, in the history of Chinese literary history, right, than politicians. Before politicians, there's no order here, but like for like artists, they just love Zhuangzi. Um, 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 and don't settle, like always in this process of exploring yourself, and leave it open. Don't confine yourself to certain, right? And I think the literary style of the book is also interesting, especially the inner chapter, that actually it turned itself turned against the authorship of Zhuangzi himself. Like there's a lot of questions like, oh, am I saying something? Should I say anything? Am I saying nothing? Right? This is self-questioning, like, right, is to empower the readers, like give the agency back to the reader to figure out what I'm doing here. So rather than like X, Y, and Z, oh, here are the 10 principles, like doctrines you need to follow. So
Lastly, Peng, is there anything you're working on that we should keep an eye out for coming up?
oh no, I'm just for my own research. I'm working on an anarchist reading of Zhuangzi. I'm thinking maybe there is anarchy here in this writing, even though the term is very Western and also very modern. Like it's the kind of revolt against, right, the depressive capitalist, right, pluralist state, that made people think that maybe we could just do something better in our own ways. I'm trying to figure out if there's such thing to Zhuangzi. So that's my current project.
Thank you so much, Peng, for your time today. I really appreciate chatting with you.
Thank you, Skylar. Yeah, take care.